Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation. To say it was a crazy summer in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, is putting it mildly. In the space of 6 weeks, the capital city was twice the focus of national and international attention. First with the police shooting and the protests that followed, and then with a crippling flood that submerged parts of the city. Covering it all was one news organization, The Advocate, and leading The Advocate was the editor we have with us today. The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. We serve journalists in the U.S. and around the world. I'm Chris Adams, Director of Training at the National Press Foundation, an installment today in our Masterclass series. I'm joined by Peter Kovacs, editor of The Advocate in South Louisiana, a newspaper with editions in Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and Lafayette. He's here to talk about the police shootings that riveted the nation and the flood that came soon after, a flood that damaged the homes of many of his reporters and editors. If it seems like a rerun, it is. Peter was also a top editor at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans when that city was swamped by Hurricane Katrina. Reporters and editors covered that storm even though many of their homes had been destroyed. For leading the Advocate staff through two major news stories, Peter was awarded the National Press Foundation's 2016 Benjamin C. Bradlee Editor of the Year Award, and I'm thrilled to have him here as our guest today. Peter, welcome.
Thank you.
So I want to give a little bit of a history here. I have a personal connection with you. Peter Kovacs was my first editor, one of my first editors at the Times-Picayune when I was a young reporter, and you were city editor and then managing editor of the Times-Picayune. And so it's been great to see you again after all these years. So I want to talk a little bit about the award that you won. You won the award, Editor of the Year award, named after Benjamin Bradlee, the former editor of the Washington Post. And here's what some of the judges had to say about you. Peter Kovacs has demonstrated great leadership in extremely challenging times. He has twice rallied his staff to perform heroic journalism in the aftermath of historic flooding, believing in the strength of printed word to serve a community in times of crisis. Kovacs skillfully steered the coverage of the police shootings of a black man in Baton Rouge that roiled the community and the subsequent shootings of law officers. When a journalistic and business opportunity opened up in New Orleans, The Advocate seized both under his leadership. And for his deep commitment to journalistic excellence is in the finest tradition of the legendary Benjamin C. Bradlee. So congratulations on winning that award.
Okay, well thank you. It's great to be here.
Okay, so I want to talk about all those points, starting with the last one, the business opportunity. This is a time of retrenchment in the newspaper business, in the news business. We've been in chaos for a couple of decades, really seriously for the last decade. But during that time, you're involved in an expansion of news. So tell us about The Advocate and what are you doing in the markets down in South Louisiana?
Okay. Well, I guess I'm both a victim and a beneficiary of retrenchment because my story starts in May of 2012 when the Times-Picayune in New Orleans decided to abandon daily publication and kind of abandon the print business,
right,
and become what was then described as a website emphasizing sports and entertainment. And as part of that, I was laid off. And I learned of that by reading it one evening in the New York Times in a larger piece about the strategy and the sort of radical and unexpected change for a newspaper that had performed so well in Katrina. And the people of New Orleans didn't take to that. They didn't like that change. They didn't like being part of what was described as an experiment by advanced publications. People don't like to be part of an experiment they don't volunteer to be part of. And there was a lot of protest against it from the governor and the mayor, and even the archbishop and every single legislator. And so there was an opportunity kind of hiding in plain sight to launch a daily newspaper in New Orleans. And in my time in this business there, when the newspaper business was very prosperous, companies tried to launch into adjacent markets, the LA Times in Orange County and Dallas and Fort Worth. And, companies spent millions trying to take an adjacent market and for the most part were repulsed and, retreated and gave up and laid off people.
Right.
So it's an amazing thing where we are in New Orleans because we're gaining and we're going to win, and we're doing it at a time when most people would tell you that to launch a new newspaper and go into a new market would be nuts.
So, I mean, in New Orleans particularly, that's where I worked and that's where I knew you. I mean, people of New Orleans had a real sense of loyalty to the Picayune. I mean, is that a fair description?
Yeah, the Picayune was, it's tough being a journalist, and journalists are under attack all the time nowadays, but the Picayune was popular in New Orleans, never more so than during Hurricane Katrina, when the city was so abandoned and voiceless, and conventional leaders like the mayor were failing to speak on behalf of the city. And so the Picayune was popular, and it was a great brand. And the idea that the idea that what they did, it was sort of parallel to, I don't know if you're old enough to remember this, New Coke, when
I do remember the New Coke. Yeah.
When Coke had a perfectly successful brand and taste and decided to redesign the formula that they make Coke by, and nobody liked it.
Right. I mean, I still remember. I mean, I came back to New Orleans to cover Katrina for a different news organization, and I remember I was in a bar in the French Quarter one night, a week or so, or a few days, I'm sorry, after Katrina, when your first printed product actually got delivered to New Orleans, and there was a sense of giddiness that the Picayunes are here. I mean, people in town really took to it. So when they took it away, they didn't like that, right?
People loved the Picayune, and I said this at the time, not just because I got laid off, but someday they'll study this thing in Harvard Business School as an example of how not to do something alongside, New Coke and Enron and stuff like that.
Okay. So, well, tell me about the Advocate. I mean, it used to be the Morning Advocate in Baton Rouge, and it was kind of renamed, rebranded. And tell me about the expansion in New Orleans and Lafayette.
Well, after the Picayune made its move, there was a great deal of discontent in New Orleans. There was a feeling among civic leaders in New Orleans that a great city should have its own daily newspaper, in the same way that it should have, a symphony and a theater company and a successful football team and various there were various efforts to bend the curve, including there were visits to the Newhouse family. There were, letters signed by people. At one point, a bunch of civic leaders signed letters to, I think, 22 Newhouse family members and were rebuffed. And one of the efforts was to go to Baton Rouge and ask the owners of the Advocate at the time, which was the Manship family, to come into New Orleans. And the Manship family had owned the Advocate for 100 years. It's really always been owned in Louisiana. And they very gamely and boldly took a stab at that. And they hired some of the laid-off talent, some talented people, and they went into New Orleans and they picked up, 10 or 20,000 subscribers just off the anger. But they were not as financially strong, perhaps, as they needed to be. And so I would say 8 months into the effort, they sold it to John George's, who took over a family company that was in distribution to stores and had built it up into, I think, a dozen states and had been very successful. And so he bought it, and his vision, which is where I got involved, was to invest money in it, hire familiar names who had been successful at the Picayune and take on the Picayune and give New Orleans a daily newspaper, and that was where I got involved.
And this was 2012?
This was early 2013.
Okay.
I mean, I guess I learned, I didn't know this was going on at first, and I would say in January of 13, I learned of this, and Dan Shea, who was with me at the Picayune, and I started meeting with John quietly at his corporate office and discussing how to make it work. And he was committed to it.
Okay. And so, I mean, the Advocate has its roots in Baton Rouge, and now you're moving into different markets. I mean, how do you answer a couple things for me.
Yeah.
How did you actually assemble the staff? And then how do you make connections with readers and sources in those locales? A new market.
Yeah.
served by a newspaper for a long time. What do you do?
Well, assembling the staff was in some ways easier than you would think, because the model that advanced publication had, there are a lot of smart, good journalists in New Orleans, and I think it was obvious to everybody, the consumers of the Times-Picayune, the employees of the Times-Picayune, the only people who didn't understand it were the owners of the Times-Picayune, that this was a bad idea and it wasn't going to work, that people don't want a 3-day-a-week newspaper, and that a sports and entertainment website is not what New Orleans needs, and doesn't fulfill the civic needs of the community and the information needs of the community. And so a lot of staff members wanted to come over once they understood what we were doing. At the time, in early 13, I would meet with them often at secret locations. I didn't know you at the time. I now have a very distinctive sort of powder blue convertible, and people would ask that I not bring the convertible because it was unique in New Orleans, and they didn't want to be seen with me. So we met. We parked around the corner and we met at some secret locations, and I always said, like starting the Advocate was like having, 8 of the first 10 NFL draft choices.
Right.
Everybody wanted to come over. It wasn't really about money, it was about mission. And so it was, we essentially assembled a team of leading journalists who were familiar, who had sources, columnists whose names were known, and I found all of them were excited about it and wanted to join.
And so this is the New Orleans Advocate. Yeah. And then what was going on over in Lafayette? When did that start?
In Lafayette, also in 13. The Advocate was already in Lafayette.
Okay.
And they produced an edition there, and we expanded at the time and rebranded it as the Acadiana Advocate. And they already had a decent amount of business there, because chiefly for coverage of like LSU sports and politics, which the Advocate was very good at those things before I got there.
Right. And
people admired that work. And so, we went in there, and people were frustrated with the Advertiser, which was thin and which is owned by Gannett. And
the Daily Advertiser.
The Daily Advertiser in Lafayette.
Okay.
One thing I learned is that, Gannett is a very well-run company. They are very tough to compete with, in contrast to Advanced Publications, which I think is not a well-run company. It's pretty easy to compete with. And so Lafayette is, you're fighting competent people in Lafayette. And we have a friendly relationship with them. We do some things jointly with them now.
And so we have in South Louisiana, we have 2 markets, New Orleans and Lafayette, that now have competing newspapers.
Yes, and Lafayette in some ways always did, but it's unusual. I don't think that, we have a cordial relationship with Gannett in Lafayette. We compete in some areas and collaborate in some areas. In New Orleans, people like to think of it as a newspaper war. I don't completely think of it as a newspaper war, because they don't want to be in the newspaper business. There is we do compete directly online with them, and they're very good at online. I think they have discovered over the 4 years they've done this that their belief that you could have a robust, shoe leather, investigative newsroom based on online revenue is simply incorrect.
Okay.
And that was the problem.
And so tell me about the relative sizes of the staffs in New Orleans particularly.
Okay. In New Orleans, sizes of staffs are hard to compare because the functions are different. Okay. And what we do, for example, we do all of the page design and composition in Baton Rouge, and they do the page design and composition in New Orleans. Their New Orleans staff that does that also does their Alabama papers. Okay. And so they, in terms of sort of shoe leather reporting and boots on the ground, I would say their staff is maybe 2 to 2.5 times the size of ours. We have about 24 people.
Okay.
In Baton Rouge, we have, Baton Rouge staff is larger because it includes all the people who design the pages, and and some of the editing structure. So, but we are my experience, and I do pay attention to this, is with less reporters, we don't get beat on significant things, and we beat them on most of the stories where I think people follow it. We beat them.
And so, I mean, if you have a smaller staff, I mean, how do you decide how to direct those reporters? What do you choose to not pay attention to so you can focus on like the prime stories of the day?
Well, their reporters are tied down with a lot of, I think, foolish concepts that come from their corporate headquarters in New York and which come from consultants they hired, such as they have posting quotas, and there's a lot of I wouldn't say counterproductive. There's a lot of work they do that I don't think makes financial sense and audience sense for what they're doing. And so we have, I think we not only have the better talent, but I also think we have a better concept of what journalists should be doing, in New Orleans and what people expect. That's kind of a big picture question, big picture issue here. You're forced to confront with trying to figure out what your audience wants when you have far fewer resources than you once had at your disposal. I mean, in its heyday, the Times-Picayune had a good-sized staff for the size of market it had. You had the luxury to cover all the boards and commissions and the neighborhoods. How do you decide? I mean, how do you decide what the readers really want so you're not wasting resources by going after those small matters? I mean, some of the way you've decided that, dating back to when we were young, is the instinct, the what people talk about, the friends that we used to go on scout campouts for St. Martin's, and what they were interested in. Of course, in the digital era, you also have a lot of metrics that tell you what gets clicks, and that's informative. I don't believe that you should be like a slave to it, but it is informative, and it has over the past generation, it's influenced the way American media works and what it covers, and there's much more celebrity news. When I was young, and now that I'm old, I still think this, why do we care what celebrities think of politics? It's the stupidest damn thing, and it does get a lot of coverage nowadays because it gets clicks. And I guess we've learned that the public, who was it? Meryl Streep. The public cares what Meryl Streep thinks about Donald Trump. I confess I don't.
Okay. Well, how about some big ticket items like coverage of the Saints? I mean, do you try to compete against the Picayune on that? Oh yeah, we have terrific Saints guys. They have more staff on the Saints. You can't have enough on the Saints. We have an enormous advantage on the Saints, which is that we produce a home-delivered Monday newspaper, and people like getting a newspaper on their yard and reading about Saints victories. Saints victories have been a little scarce for that lately. It worked better when the Saints were better. But people like seeing the composition of a newspaper. They like seeing the coverage, in print after a Saints game. Okay. So I want to talk about kind of the coverage of these big breaking news events. I mean, that's what happened. That's what you won the award for. That's what happened in Baton Rouge. I mean, during my time with you and during your, was it 25 years at the Picayune?
29.
29. I mean, you developed the reputation as being the real newsroom field marshal, the person who kind of commandeered the staff in these big breaking things. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about Hurricane Katrina, which was the biggest of those big things. But what are some of the other kind of big breaking local stories that also were national stories that you were involved with?
Well, New Orleans is a hotbed of news. There's it punches above its weight in news, or whatever that expression would be. And New Orleans, I don't think people appreciate this, but New Orleans in some ways invented the modern version of sports tourism. And it did it by building the Superdome in downtown New Orleans in the 70s at a time when most communities were building in the suburbs. And that was a huge positive decision that went against the grain. And people don't know this, but 4 of the 10 Super Bowls in the 70s were in New Orleans, which wouldn't happen nowadays. And And so New Orleans, so being a journalist in New Orleans, you kind of learned there was always a big event this year or next year. The big event that I really learned how to organize on was the Republican Convention, which was in '88. I guess you were in New Orleans. Were you in New Orleans in '88?
I wasn't there yet.
Okay.
No.
The Republican Convention, which was in '88. And and we had a staff of, I want to say, 270 people, and everybody was going to be involved. And what I came to appreciate is that you break the event into teams that are based on concepts. And so for the Republican Convention, one team covered the actual politics, and that, people don't remember this. This was the convention where George Bush, the first, was nominated to succeed Ronald Reagan. And it was also in the Superdome where he famously said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Which, so in a way, the event that was his coronation was also his undoing. And so, but the politics was just a piece of it. There were a lot of other pieces of it. The parties, which were spectacular, were an important piece of it. And one of the things we did that I thought was innovative at the time was to put a lot of people on the parties and to recognize that this actually isn't a news event because everybody knows who's going to win. It's a party event where a bunch of people get together who don't get to see each other very often. So there was that. There was the vice presidential selection, which people don't remember this either, but he picked Dan Quayle, which was another thing that didn't work out for him. So there was that. We were organized to the point where there was a guy covering the Guam delegation, and I think we actually wrote some stuff about the Guam delegation. There was the city's hosting of it. It was an important event for the city. The city wanted to. New Orleans had really been wounded at that time by the oil bust in the 80s and also by the failure of the World's Fair in '84. And so it was very important for the city to, sort of get its moxie back and prove that it could host a big event flawlessly. And by the way, it did, and it was very proud of it. And so there was coverage of that aspect. There was crime, which fortunately there wasn't any of. That would have been, sort of bad for business. And so the way I discovered to do this is that you organize, reporters and editors into teams, and you sort of write lots of memos so that everybody knows, who's in charge of what team and how to find them. And this was before cell phones, so you couldn't just text people. And just think of it as a big organizational task. And then once people know what they're supposed to do, they generally do it very well.
Okay, so that was an event that you could plan out well in advance and dispatch your 270 warm bodies and however many different teams you had. Let's talk a little bit about Hurricane Katrina. The Picayune won 2 Pulitzers that year for coverage of the storm and its aftermath. But also, as part of that is the Picayune got a lot of goodwill for essentially anticipating what would happen if the city was hit that way. And for the harrowing way the Picayune actually had to cover the thing. Tell us about, you're the field general here. What happened to your newsroom? What did you have to do to cover the storm?
Well, it was interesting because in 2000, maybe 2 or 3, we had published a big special report of 8 days. I can't remember the length of it. And the premise of it was that billions or millions at the time had been spent to make New Orleans hurricane-proof. Money that started with Hurricane Betsy in '65, and that the city was, less safe than ever. And it was less safe than ever because of decay of the wetlands, and in a sense, the loss of land moved New Orleans closer to the coast. And it was also less safe than ever because the premise on which they built the flood protection, which was the way flood protection operated before Katrina, was that they would build levees and flood walls based on the height of water during Betsy. But hurricanes have a million different strengths, a million different paths. It's not just the strength of the winds, it's how long it lingers, because a longer, slower hurricane piles more water into the coast. And so the premise of this was that New Orleans wasn't safe from a hurricane. And some of the details in it were examples of what would happen, including failure of the electric grid, flooding of, you wouldn't have running water, you wouldn't have sewers. So when Katrina when Katrina arrived, we kind of knew what it might look like.
Right.
Katrina was known to be the biggest hurricane ever to assault New Orleans. It was not a surprise what Katrina was. The only guy who seems really to have been unprepared was that Brownie guy,
right.
Michael Brown from
Right.
FEMA and FEMA had, I think, one guy in New Orleans for that. And so it was, it was anticipated. We were, I thought, really well organized.
Yeah.
We had people in the right places. We had, I thought we had a good staffing plan. Once that, hit the reality of it, like a war plan, it came apart in some ways.
Right.
Not the least of which was I don't think we really expected, and we had provisions to be in the Times-Picayune building for a week, including generators and food, and the generators did not power the press or the air conditioning, as I can attest.
Right.
But they powered computers, and so we were as prepared as you could be. I don't think we were prepared to be a concrete island surrounded by 4 feet of water.
Right.
And we invented on the fly what I think became many of the premises of digital journalism, which was the discovery that you didn't need to print a newspaper in order to tell people what was going on. In fact, not only did we not have the electricity to print a newspaper, if we would have been able to print a newspaper, we would have had to deliver it by boat using carriers who had fled to households that weren't there.
Right.
So the only way really to communicate was digitally, and we invented, I thought made like 10 years of progress in a week, including what are now just accepted ideas, but were new at the time, like you don't need to wait. You don't need to gather all the wool and wait to write your story on deadline. You just put the wool online when you gather it. And that's what we did. And one of the interesting things, we had the capability to design and lay out a newspaper, and we thought we might print one remotely, perhaps in Baton Rouge. And we designed a beautiful, I think, 16-page newspaper. It may have been 15 pages.
Yeah.
Or it didn't matter how many pages. Because we could do it and because that was how we thought, we designed newspapers every night and put them online, and people read them. But more people, this was the big discovery, and we did this, and I'm very proud of it. And we thought, well, people are going to open up this digital newspaper and read the digital newspaper, but they didn't quite consume it the way we expected. Right. They consumed it through whatever we put on the website. And the biggest thing, I think 2/3 of the page views were photos.
Really? Okay.
And photos were, and again, you learn as a word guy, you don't always appreciate the power of photojournalism. People looked at photos. The photos it was terrific photojournalism. It was riveting. And people were additionally compelled to look at them because most of the people who consumed this news, at least who were New Orleanians, were, families evacuated, staying with grandma in Alabama.
Right.
And, so you're in Alabama, you're with your kids and your dog, and you don't really have anything to do. There's no school, and you're not going to work. And so you're sitting there consuming this, and people would look at the photos. And I think one of the reasons people looked at the photos was, they were looking at something familiar. And, if I saw a photo, that showed the from where I lived in Metairie, if the corner of Transcontinental and West Esplanade was underwater, I was underwater.
Right.
So you were kind of looking for what was underwater, and a lot of people are sitting. These people are sitting all over the South,
right,
not knowing whether their home's flooded.
Right. Exactly.
You either, I always said at the time, either you knew your home flooded 100% or you didn't know whether your home flooded. But
right.
I don't think anybody knew their home didn't flood.
Okay. And you guys, the Picayune, you were in that concrete fortress in near downtown New Orleans, which has always withstood every hurricane over the years. But you realized that you had to get out, and so you loaded into trucks and went.
We realized we had to get out. That for one thing, the water, we had a week of supplies, but the water wasn't going away. We also couldn't get journalists, and we couldn't, to get out, you'd have to do everything by boat, and that wasn't practical. And also the water was rising at the time. And I remember I spent the night in that building, sleeping on the floor. And when I went to bed, and you knew the water was rising, but you kind of didn't know how much it was going to rise. And it was very hard to sleep. It was hot, so it was very hard to sleep. But I dozed off and fell asleep. And I was woken up at about 5 in the morning. I was next to the general manager of the company. And at 5 in the morning, someone comes by and wakes him up and says, you know, we need to do something. The water's about to come in the building. So I heard that, and I sat up and I said, oh, that can't be a good thing. And I went to look, and that building was probably 4 feet off the ground.
Yeah.
And there's a little staircase up to it, and the water is up the last step. And you can see it folding around the banister, heading toward the Superdome, which means the water was still moving pretty swiftly into the city, which meant it was rising. It wasn't flowing away. If it was flowing the other way, it would have crested.
Right.
And so we felt like the water was going to come in the building, and and it was the middle of the night. It was dark, and so you really couldn't do anything or act on it because you couldn't find anyone. You didn't know. You'd have to like shine flashlights in people's face and say, oh, you're not the guy I'm looking for.
Right.
But it got light, and eventually we realized we had to leave that. And and the only way out really was, we had about 250 people in there, including, it was the policy at the time that families could be, because we wanted people to work, especially press operators. The rule was that you could bring your family, and it was a big concrete building, so it was sheltered. And so that was an incentive, because it beat evacuating. So we had family members. There was maybe like a 2-month-old baby and like a 90-year-old lady there. And the family members were helpful. They worked in the kitchen and distributed food, and it was actually a nice community. There was a room where they showed pictures for children to watch. And so the only way to get that many people out was in those circulation trucks. And my recollection is we sent a guy to drive one of the trucks and find a way out where the water would not foul the engine of the truck. And we sent one guy to do that because we didn't want to put 250 people in trucks and have the trucks flood. That would have been worse. Right. And so he took about an hour, and he came back and found a way to do it. And then everyone was told to get in the truck. And you got 2 minutes to gather up whatever crap you're taking, and it has to fit in your lap, and get in the back of this truck. And we left we actually left in a convoy, but messed up our planning, and so we got split into 2 convoys. And since there was no cell phone service, we lost track of each other. And I was in the second, the later convoy, and we instantly chose different ways to get out of there, and got crossed up and wound up in the same. We wound up, both of us, in Baton Rouge, but in different places in Baton Rouge. Okay. And and in the course of it, one of the things I remember was escaping the city and getting up on the ramps up to the bridge across the Mississippi River. And we knew that the West Bank had not flooded. I can't remember how we knew that, but I guess, if a hurricane blows water onto one place, it blows it off another. So if a hurricane blows water onto Manhattan, it blows it off New Jersey, is one way to look at it. Right. So some place has to be dry. Right. And we knew the West Bank was dry, and we went across the river, and I remember going up the ramps up to the bridge and seeing that the strip of New Orleans along the river was not flooded, which was not something I think I understood at the time. And so when we got across the river, we realized that we could go back and try to set up operations in the unflooded part of New Orleans. And so some people did that, and they did it in staff members' houses. Right. And that was how we started. And then we sent some people went to Houma, where there was a paper at the time owned by the New York Times, and they were very good to us, and they gave us their conference room and some computers. And then others went to Baton Rouge. And the other thing I learned from this is that, this was the first time I saw how you can practice journalism like with very little stuff. Right. Like, at the time with laptops, essentially. We didn't even have like the typefaces that we used in the newspaper and all that. We didn't have those. they were in computers in New Orleans,
Right.
and we still produced great online content, and eventually we produced a newspaper without all that stuff and printed it in Houma.
Right. So let's jump ahead to last summer.
Okay.
So you referred to it as the Summer of Turmoil, and we actually have a video produced by the Advocate that showcases some of that work. So let's watch that video right now.
It's always a challenge to cover the news, but over the summer we found ourselves covering the news and living the news in the same moment.
On the morning of July 5th, Baton Rouge police were called to a neighborhood store to investigate a report of a man with a gun. Within minutes, they tussled with the armed man, Alton Sterling, wounding him mortally. What started as a routine police call on a quiet night soon became the focus of protests around the nation, followed by attacks on police officers. Soon after, there was a crisis of a different sort. The Great Flood of 2016, measuring up as the worst natural disaster in the United States since Superstorm Sandy. These events would play out over 6 breathtaking weeks, all in one place, Baton Rouge.
For our staff, the Summer of Turmoil was both a professional and a personal experience.
All I wanted to do was take a photograph before going into the office the Saturday of the flooding. And I wound up spending over 30 hours on Interstate 12 in Livingston Parish next to the town of Holden.
This is my house. I've lived here 23 years. It's never flooded, so you can imagine my shock when a neighbor came banging on my door on August 13th, screaming at me to get out, the river is coming down the road.
I was on the way to work and I was washed off the highway into the woods. As the car was filling with water, I did manage to escape out the car, made it to my rooftop, and waited for a rescue team in about 4 hours before I was rescued.
The flooding impacted a quarter of our Baton Rouge staff, but not just employees. Carriers lost their homes and their cars. Subscribers were displaced, often to hotels or shelters or the homes of relatives. The disaster brought us together, and we formed crews to help gut the homes of flooded colleagues. We called ourselves muckrakers, and over 2 hot weekends we stripped out moldy sheetrock and flooring from about 20 homes. Our work for our community and for each other affirmed the importance of a local newspaper and the benefits of local ownership.
Over 3 years, Peter has built a world-class news organization, covering news not only in Baton Rouge, but also in New Orleans and Lafayette.
The Advocate has been owned in Louisiana for more than a century, and our owners, John and Dathel Georges, could not have been more supportive.
In there you said that, quote, we found ourselves covering the news and living the news at the same moment. What was that like? I mean, you're covering it, you're part of it.
Well, it's very stressful. I think it produces, in some ways, the best journalism I've ever been associated with. One of the problems with journalism, and I think when you look at cases where journalism thinks it failed or where journalists think journalism failed, it's because the people covering it are distant from the story. And we're living in a moment, as we think on the 2016 election, where I think journalism thinks it failed.
Right.
And I don't know that it failed as badly as it thinks it failed. But if it failed, I think one of the reasons it failed is that, how many journalists have an uncle or a cousin who works at a car plant and is afraid that their job's going to move to Mexico or China? Or how many journalists have people who are in the coal business who understand the dislocation going on in those areas? And so I think that's one of the reasons. I think that's one of the reasons people are looking at what journalism did now and saying, what did we miss here? That was not that's not a problem when you cover an event like Katrina or the flooding, because it visits everyone. It visits every member of your staff. In Katrina, I always looked at it as, everyone's life is kind of rooted in where they live, where they work, where their spouse works, where their kids go to school. So let's say it's 5 different locations, and different people were different combinations of those things flooding.
Right.
My work didn't flood, my wife's work flooded, my house flooded, or my house flooded and my work didn't flood, but they want me to work anyhow. Or,
right.
my kids can't go to school because their school flooded. And so it visited everybody. And when you cover something and live it, you just have so much more insight into, what's going wrong. One of the things I noticed was, and I used to discuss this with our friends from, the people we befriended as St. Martin's parents, is how, all of us were people who had never asked the government for anything. The government does a great job protecting us, when I did a great job protecting us from communism, and does a great job protecting us from terrorism, and they build great highways and clean our air, and I think the government does terrific things for us, but for the most part, we don't interact with it.
Right.
It provides services, and occasionally we run into a government employee at the airport when we get on the plane. But this was a case where everybody kind of saw how government worked and how it doesn't work in many cases. I remember getting, in Katrina, you would get, you'd get government aid. You registered for government aid. And I remember at one point I got a check for $2,375 with a letter saying, here's a check for $2,375. We'll send you a letter later telling you what you can do with it.
That was from FEMA, maybe?
It was a distribution to displaced people.
Okay.
And it was good, the idea of helping displaced people made sense, but and I appreciated the $2,300. I never, by the way, got a letter telling me what to do with the $2,300.
So that means you haven't spent it, right?
It's just still sitting there waiting on FEMA to ask.
Okay.
So I think in many ways that informed the coverage. I mean, people were experiencing what they were covering. They were experiencing the way in which the aid programs were confusing. Some people got money that they sort of shouldn't have gotten. Other people weren't getting money that they should have gotten. They experienced, what am I going to do to send my kid to school? They experienced, our church flooded and there's no government program for that we know of. And it really, I think, made coverage stronger because instead of having to go interview people and waiting to see what was going on, it came to you. I remember one little thing I recall was how people were, in New Orleans, people were waiting online for an entire day to get a building permit.
Wow.
And, we wrote about that, and then they changed the way, maybe they were going to let you do a little more construction without a building permit, under the circumstances. And just little things like that you'd never find out if you weren't living in it.
Okay. So let's give us the two events, police shootings and protests, and then the flood, Baton Rouge floods. So just give me the 30-second recap. What happened in July with the police shootings, and then how do you organize a staff for an event like that, and particularly how do you kind of maintain their safety in a volatile situation like big protests?
The first there were essentially two news incidents in the police shooting. The first was when the police shot Alton Sterling, and the magnitude of that event really didn't make itself clear until there was cell phone video of it. Any police shooting of a civilian is newsworthy and gets a lot of scrutiny. In the case of Sterling, he was armed, which I think is not, a lot of people who appreciate the event, I don't think understand that he was armed. And what really sort of set it off as a cause was that there was a video of it. And people don't remember this part of it either, but the next day there was the police shooting in Minnesota where, I can't remember her name, the woman Facebooked her.
Right.
She didn't Facebook the shooting, of which there's no video to my knowledge, but she Facebooked the aftermath of it, and that was very riveting. And and both of those events just, I think, acquainted people with how messy, police work can be and how difficult the situations can be. And so Baton Rouge had a lot of, Baton Rouge was a center of protesting. One of the things, I'm proudest of from our coverage is that Baton Rouge was a place where it would have been expected that there would be, violence in the protesting. For one thing, it was place where the event occurred, and you know, it's poor and it's hot and all that. But Baton Rouge was, you know, peaceful. There was not a lot of, there was no vandalism that I know of. There were clashes with police and protesters, but there were very few injuries. Nothing got burned down. No freeways got taken over, which happened in a lot of other communities.
Right.
And I don't think we felt, endangered. I don't think our people felt endangered. There were a couple of cases where police arrested journalists, but not ours. I think there was a TV guy arrested. And one of the things that our Metro editor did that I thought was smart after that was she got everyone shirts and hats that say they're with the Advocate, that you're supposed to equip yourself with it, and this way, if you know, this way you won't get swept up in someone else's matter. And so it was, I mean, it was difficult to cover. It went on, you know, it was very emotional. It went on for days. I think this is sort of classically a case where, you know, two different factions see two different realities in the news, and neither one of them is willing to look at the other person's reality. And so this went on for 10 days maybe, and then on a Sunday morning, a guy from out of town kind of ambushed police at a handy-pack service station place and killed 3, wounded 3 others, one of them very grievously, who's still struggling, and was eventually, you know, kind of gunned down by police. And the thing I remember about that morning was there was enormous anger at the demonstrators, as if the demonstrators, and a little bit at the newspaper, as if somehow they had caused this to happen. And one of our reporters, about 4.5 hours after the shooting, reported by Twitter that the killer was from Missouri. And just that little detail, I thought, really changed the dynamic. Like, all of a sudden, it wasn't, you know, people stopped for a second and said, oh, I wonder what that's about. And, you know, it turned out that he was a loner who had nothing to do with Baton Rouge. Still to this day, we don't know why he was in Baton Rouge. I think he was in Baton Rouge to kill police officers, but and maybe he chose Baton Rouge because of the Sterling thing. He'd actually been in Dallas, where 5 police officers were shot.
Right.
Our understanding is he had been in Dallas during that, and someone else shot the police, and I don't know whether that prompted him to leave Dallas and look for another place to do it, but he was in Baton Rouge for the purpose of killing police, and he killed 3, and they killed him. The whole thing lasted 8 minutes.
Wow. And so the protests are still going on at this time? This is like 10 days after the Sterling shooting?
The protests were, it was a little calmer, I would say. After the police were shot, I think both sides to some degree sobered up, and I think the community became a little more united, and the Sterling, the Sterling family was terrific and very responsible in condemning violence, and our editorial page editor memorably, at least to me, wrote 19 consecutive days of editorials about this, different aspects of it.
Right.
And I thought after the police were shot, that kind of ended the demonstrations, and they're very passionate demonstrators wanted to get back at it, but I think other people said it would be sort of disrespectful to be demonstrating against the police during funerals of police.
Right.
And it was 3 funerals and a memorial service, so that went on for a week, and it was very. I thought the community really came together very nicely in that tragedy.
And your reporters and photographers out on the streets, I mean, what kind of feedback or connection did they have with the community, and also particularly with law enforcement? Was there hostility or friendliness? What was it like?
It varies, from individual to individual. We have good relationships with law enforcement. There were complaints against some of the tactics of law enforcement that we reported on, and I think they didn't like that. And at the same time, in aggregate, a credit to both sides. There was no, people weren't burning stuff down in Baton Rouge. There was no significant vandalism. There were no significant injuries. And I think in the end, people sort of took that as a credit to the community. And I think it's a credit to news coverage that's responsible and doesn't incite that. Because I think that's, above all, that's the goal of a community, is to not descend into civil war when you're going to disagree with each other.
Okay. And then after the shootings of the police and then the memorial services, then you said there was a couple of weeks until August 13th happened? What happened then?
There were a couple of, those issues were still very prominent in the community. They started to move from protests in the street to kind of some civic proposals about how the police department should operate. The big controversy was that a lot of the Baton Rouge police force didn't live in the city. They lived in Livingston Parish, where the schools are better, including the 3 officers who were killed. All lived in Livingston Parish, and 2 were white and 1 was black. And so there became kind of a civic movement to make police live in the city, but it was a difficult time to be criticizing police, especially for living in Livingston Parish when 3 police who lived in Livingston Parish had just been shot. And that was going on, and I don't, it's not my place to judge whether that's good or bad public policy, but there were people pushing for it, and whether it's good or bad public policy, it probably wasn't the sort of thing that you would enact a week after an incident like that. There was also a mayor's race going on in Baton Rouge, and so it would also be kind of odd to change public policy when you're going to have a new mayor in 4 months anyhow. And the mayoral candidates became an issue where the mayoral candidates would take a position which was probably appropriate that would be resolved at the ballot box. And so it was still, it was still going on when the rain started falling. It wasn't as, I would say it wasn't as heated or as emotional anymore, but it was still the prevalent story. And there was also, there were so many unanswered questions about the killer and what he'd been doing in Baton Rouge, and I don't think that ever was really unraveled. And there was also, and still is, a federal investigation of the shooting of Sterling, which in theory could be criminal, although I'm not sure it will be.
Okay, and so the rain started falling. So how much advance warning did you have that there could potentially be some crippling floods?
Most of the floods in Louisiana you associate flooding in Louisiana with hurricanes or New Orleans or the Mississippi River. And this was interesting because none of that, it didn't involve any of that. And there were weather forecasts that it was going to be, it was a weekend, and there were weather forecasts that it was going to be a very rainy weekend, and I remember reacting to it by thinking that I had really planned on going fishing and now I wasn't going to get to do it. And they said it was going to rain, there's going to be heavy rain, but that happens, once a year. I don't think we were prepared for kind of the volume of rain. And so it really snuck up on people. It was the opposite of Katrina. Katrina snuck up on people. You knew something terrible was going to happen, but you didn't realize that there was going to be so much levee failure because, for years they had told us what a great job they did building the levees. This was different. Katrina was a failure of civil engineering, really the greatest failure of civil engineering in the history of America. This was, a 1,000-year storm that was not predicted, and I'm not sure, all of the flood control measures that were half finished or contemplated probably wouldn't have stopped this. This was probably too much.
And how much? Just describe for our listeners here the scope of the flooding. I mean, how much of East Baton Rouge Parish and surrounding area was actually affected? It
affected roughly a quarter to a third of the structures. I don't know how much of the geographic area. But in most entities, we had a quarter of our Baton Rouge employees flooded. That's normative. If you asked the guy, you meet with the guy who runs the hospital and say, well, how many of your employees were flooded? And they would have similar answers. So it was an enormous event. It was actually, I've had the misfortune and privilege of covering the first and fourth costliest floods in American history.
Okay.
And this was the fourth costliest flood in American history.
And Baton Rouge is a metro area of how big?
It's about a little less than 1 million.
Okay.
I mean, depending on which parishes you put in there
Right.
and all that.
And so like
it's smaller than New Orleans.
I mean, New Orleans is 1.2 or something like
Yeah.
that, or was.
Yes.
And East Baton Rouge isn't that much smaller.
Baton Rouge is not that much smaller. The parish of East Baton Rouge is actually the biggest parish in Louisiana, which was what New Orleans was the biggest parish in Louisiana, but it never got its population back after Katrina. New Orleans is probably 80% of what it was before Katrina in the city. The suburbs came back better.
So a quarter of your staff roughly was impacted directly?
A quarter of our staff was flooded.
Flooded, okay.
So, yeah.
I mean, how do you describe the management challenges of assisting those people who are dealing with their own, personal turmoil, and your news organization is trying to cover this widespread turmoil? I mean, were those folks working? How do you handle all that?
It's in both instances. I've always been. It was amazing to me to watch the dedication of people who, had a job to do, showed up and did it, and with one side of the brain, and with the other side of the brain, their house was flooding, maybe. And one of the images I'll always have is of one of our sports editors who has 2 little kids, lives in Ascension Parish, and was working while not knowing whether his home flooded, and his family had left. No one was home, and he didn't know whether his home flooded. And another guy who works for us, the IT director, has a brother-in-law or something who's a National Guard pilot, or I don't know the details of it, but he has on his iPhone video of overhead of the sports editor's neighborhood. And I remember he came over and showed him his house didn't flood.
Oh.
And the guy who had the video, his house had flooded, and he knew it had flooded. And that reminded me of Katrina, because, whether your house flooded is a big deal to you, and it's going to determine, a lot of, the rest of your life. And, there's a moment when you're going to find out whether it did or didn't happen.
Right.
And, and people just took it in stride and kept working. And,
once they found the news, people, worked out the rest of the day.
People worked. People had a job. For one thing, if your house was flooded, you couldn't really go do anything about it if you wanted to.
Right.
And so, if people had a job to do, they did that job. One of the characteristics of the Baton Rouge flood was that in some of our area, in the northern parts of in the northern parishes, the flooding was unexpected, and people were at home, and the neighbor would knock on your door, or your cousin would call you and tell you that you better get out of there fast because it's rising. The flood, kind of charged down the street at you. So it's a big slug of water moving downstream in a way,
right?
And the magnitudes are startling. The great flood, the previous benchmark Baton Rouge flood was in '83, and this was much bigger. The flood stages were 5 feet higher in many places, and since Louisiana is pretty flat, if you get 5 feet more of flooding, it spreads out.
Right.
But in the northern parishes, it routed people out of their homes, and they didn't expect it. As the sort of slug of water moves downstream in the southern parishes, now those people knew they were going to flood. Looking at what happens in the northern parishes and realizing where you are, some people understood they were going to flood. They had time to prepare for it. They gathered up the stuff that meant something to them. They left their houses, in many cases not quite knowing what was going to happen, in some cases knowing for sure they were going to flood.
Yeah.
So people had slightly different experiences.
And and how long from when the flooding happened until the water went away and it just became a cleanup story? Was this a couple of days, or how long?
No, it was about a week.
About a week.
You'd have there were times when it was both in the northern, in Denham's. I remember one memorable day we had we shot a picture of all of downtown Denham Springs flooded, and I want to say a couple, and we had a guy up in a helicopter, every day for 5 days or whatever. And one day we were discussing what we were going to shoot in the helicopter, and I said, let's take all the photos we shot of Denham Springs and send the guy up in the helicopter, and he takes the photo and moves the helicopter to the same place and shoots the same thing now that it's dry.
Yeah.
And we published, that was then, this is now. And at the same time that was going on, areas downstream were flooding for the first time. So it was more than a week before the last of the floodwater left us in the real swampy southern areas. Alligator Bayou is the name of it, which is a cool name. And they actually had to blow up a road in order to let the water out of Alligator Bayou.
Okay.
I don't know what the alligators thought of that.
And how the decision to hire out or charter a helicopter, that's a pretty expensive proposition for a mid-sized news organization, isn't it?
Yeah, we have a great owner, and they're very supportive, and we were committed to covering it with everything we had, and I have a budget. It's learning to manage a budget is tough, but we made it within our budget, for the year, despite we spent a lot of money during that summer on not just helicopters, overtime, and
right.
A lot of stuff. We went to when the killer was from Kansas City, we went to Kansas City and didn't find out a hell of a lot about him, but we stood outside his house with a lot of other media and got shooed off.
Okay. So just a couple more questions here. Finally, in helping your staff recover, you organize teams of reporters or employees to help their colleagues.
Yeah.
You called yourself muckrakers, is that right?
We did, and actually we stole that. That was what we called ourselves after Katrina at the picnic.
Really? Okay.
So yeah, we borrowed that.
But tell our viewers who don't know there's actually two definitions of muckrakers. What actually is a muckraker?
Well, a muckraker is an investigative journalist,
right.
And we were muckrakers because gutting someone's house is an experience, and I've now had it in, like I said, two of the 4 greatest floods in America, and we probably did 20 houses. Some people who flooded had children or relatives, or their church would help them, or so we. I think the personnel manager had a list of people who we basically offered that we would help anyone who said they needed help. Some people didn't need it, and so we had a list of houses, and I wasn't the one who organized this, even though I do a lot of organizing, and so everybody would have a, you would essentially get an assignment and an address, and you would show up, and this is what it's like to gut someone's house. First of all, in many cases, it's someone you barely know.
Right.
And that was the case with me. And the homeowner, depending who he or she is, and they're usually older, just because people in the newspaper business are older, but also because younger people often take care of their own, but older people my age, it's hard to do that by yourself.
Right.
And what you're doing is one of them I remember had maybe 2.5 feet of water, and so you're removing pretty much everything on the first floor, all the furniture. You are removing whatever the flooring is, wood or carpet or tile, which is hard to remove. You have to remove the sheetrock up the wall, and normally you go up to 4 feet. Sheetrock is installed at 4 feet,
right.
And so and even if there's only 2 feet of water, it wicks in the sheetrock. So you have to go. You're trying to keep mold out of the house.
Right.
So you remove all the sheetrock, and in order to do that, you're basically you're taking all this crap to the curb and just leaving it in giant piles.
Right.
And the homeowner, this is the sad part of it, the homeowner generally sort of sits there, and the volunteers come to the homeowner, and I remember one where I was doing the dining room, and she had a big, one of those china cabinet things with all of her stuff in it, and silverware and all that, and so the thing had maybe 4 shelves, and the first 3 flooded, and the 4th shelf didn't flood, And so you'd go to the bottom shelf and you would remove the thing where you have the gravy on Thanksgiving,
right.
you know, that thing, and it would be full of disgusting, filthy sewer water. And so you would, you know, so someone would, you know, you'd pour all that out and someone would box all that stuff up.
Right.
If it was china, for example, there's, you know, you can wash it and use it again. And then, you know, one drawer had some collection of, you know, playing cards from exotic locales. And so you go to the homeowner and you'd say, well, you know, what do you want me to do with these wet playing cards from Las Vegas? And I've seen this, it's sad, but I've seen it so many times. As the day wears on, the homeowner, it sinks in on the homeowner how you're just really actually throwing everything out. And at first, they, you know, they say, oh, I don't want to get rid of that. And as if by lunchtime they're saying, okay, you're right, just throw it all out. And
right.
your standards of asking permission change as you come to realize what their standards are. You impose their standards, and separate from that, and this goes on every time, there's a photo salvage effort, and all the photo albums are, you know, are taken, and the photos are taken out of the photo albums and they're put on a place to dry. And you know, we have photographers on our staff, and so usually the photographers is who gets involved in that, and the photographers help them with ways whether the photos can be preserved or what needs to be done with them to keep them from disintegrating or whatever. There's actually companies that come in that can take your photos and retouch them or preserve them or keep them from decaying or put them on a DVD or whatever. And so, you know, and this goes on all day, and sometimes you know, you never know how many people to bring, or sometimes you know, sometimes you finish after lunch and sometimes you don't finish and you come back tomorrow, and then you go to someone else's house and do the same thing until you're done.
And then the next day you're in the newsroom with...
Yeah, the next day you go back to work. I mean, we did this on weekends, and we had people, you know, a lot of people from New Orleans, you know, people from New Orleans came down and came up and worked on it. And, you know, there were people who were, you know, you don't know how to regard your colleagues. You discover colleagues who are like really handy at stuff. And like I know electricity a little bit. You know, there are people who knew plumbing a little bit, and you have to, you know, like you're stripping out the kitchen, and so the kitchen has an electric or a gas range, so someone has to figure out where to cut all that off in order to, you know, you're getting rid of all that cabinetry, but when you're getting rid of all that cabinetry, you have to do something with the stove and the sink and all that.
Right.
And so, and you find there are some people who know how to do this. I mean, I know how to do electricity, but not plumbing.
Okay. Well, with that, Peter, I think we have to draw this to a close. I mean, it's been fascinating here. You talk about the journalism and the management challenges of leading staffs who are dealing with things like this. So I want to thank you very much. And again, congratulations on your award.
Okay. Well, I'm very excited to be here. I'm excited for our staff, and I'm excited for our community. I think our community, you know, came together, you know, in a concrete way, helped each other, got a sense of what was important. You know, still has a lot of challenges, but is in better shape than I think you would expect a community to be after all those blows.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
And with that, thank you for joining us today from the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation, where we make good journalists better. Today we've heard from Peter Kovacs, who has the uncanny ability to lead newsrooms through the most trying of stories. For that, he is NPF's 2016 Editor of the Year. Find more webinars and reporting resources at nationalpress.org, and follow us on Twitter @NatPress.